I happened to be out on a beach walk this morning, and it is so beautiful out here. The fog is coming and going, hiding the mountains from time to time. And I've got singing birds and chattering squirrels, and occasionally a boat goes by. But it seemed like a perfect opportunity to record this story. Here goes. I am sitting on the couch in my living room. It is the early, early morning, and I've got this steaming hot cup of coffee. And I've got a book on my lap, and the book is about aviation. But there's something that I've just read that has caused my brain to just slip out of the story. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking about a poem about aviation. It was written by a young pilot in World War II. Now, the poem is called High Flight, and it begins, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of." My father dreamed of slipping the surly bonds of earth. He loved to fly. And I think that if he could live his short life over again, he would have become a commercial pilot rather than a doctor. But as it was, when he was not patching up patients, he was pursuing flying. The bookshelves in my family's house were just loaded with books about flying. In time, my father became a pilot, and then he acquired several planes. There were many a Sunday when my brothers and I would be out at the airport riding our bicycles around, entertaining ourselves while my father puttered around the planes. There were many short flights, a few long family trips. Oh, from time to time we'd go to air shows where pilots would fly from all over, planes of all shapes and sizes, and they would line up these planes. There would be miles upon miles upon miles of airplanes. And with my father, we would walk up and down those rows of planes, and my father would talk to virtually every single pilot. And my brothers and I would just endure this in hopes that maybe at the end of it, we would be rewarded with, a popsicle. In grade school, I remember eating my breakfast cereal before going to school and seeing my father feed my younger sister as she sat in her high chair. He would take a spoonful of applesauce, and then that spoon would suddenly become a plane with a pilot named Slim. And my father would say, "Oh, Slim, he's flying in a snowstorm. You need to open the hangar so he can land." And my sister would open her mouth, and my dad would pilot that spoon into her mouth. Slim would offload his payload of applesauce and then fly out into that snowstorm once again. It was just reflex in my family that if you were in the house and you heard up above the sound of a familiar airplane engine, you would just drop everything. And you'd run out on the front lawn, and there would be Dad circling. And so you'd wave your arms so you could be big and visible, and then you'd watch and wait. And Dad would acknowledge he saw us. He would wiggle his wings, and then he would circle one more time, head west to the airport, and soon he would be home. Now, all of that came to an abrupt halt. One morning when I was 15, knock on the door, 2 policemen. They informed my mother, my siblings, and I that my father, who was on a special flight, had gone down. He was the pilot. He was the only one on board. Now, the date that happened, July 9th, just became seared in my brain, the way dates of important events do. So not long ago, on a July morning, I was up early. I was in my sleepiness as I was making my coffee. I realized that I needed a new book, that I had finished the various books I was reading, and so I went to my bedside table where I have a stack of books to be read, and there was this one book that just stood out to me, and it just was like, oh, perfect. Now, the book, I had acquired it a couple of months before when I had been in a used bookstore with one of my older brothers, who happens to be a commercial pilot. And he had pointed at the book. He said, "Have you read this?" It meant a lot to Dad. And so I read it, and it meant a lot to me. In fact, that might be why I became a commercial pilot. I thought, I need to read this book. So I got the book, and when I got home and I read the introduction, something happened. I mean, life was just busy, and I couldn't read the book at that time, so I put it aside. But on this morning, it felt perfect. Now, the book is called The Pathless Way, Flying the British Columbia Coast. My father grew up in British Columbia, and I grew up not far away. So this world that the pilot was going to be flying in, the waterways, the mountains, it seemed somewhat familiar. In fact, it wasn't too different from where I live right now, which is Southeast Alaska. And when I look out the window, I see this body of water, and I see the Fairweather Mountains behind me. Not far from me is a body of water known as Icy Strait. And if you fly down Icy Strait, there's the small community of Gustavus, where I get my mail. Not far away is Juneau. And if you turn south at Juneau, it's not far before Southeast Alaska just gives way to British Columbia. So I felt like the world in which this pilot would be flying would be somewhat familiar to me. Well, just then, I get a text. It's a message from my sister. She sent it out to all my siblings, and the text says, "Thinking of you all on this morning, July 9th. And I realize, the date has snuck up on me. And then I realize, oh my gosh, how perfect that on this morning of all mornings is the morning I pick up this book that meant so much to my dad. So I start reading the first story. And that's when I realized that this is not about just flying the British Columbia coast. No, the first story has to do with the Good Friday earthquake, 1964. It happened in Anchorage, Alaska. And how this pilot is chartered by two newsmen to fly them up to Anchorage so they can get the scoop on this earthquake. So they take off from British Columbia, but they fly north into Southeast Alaska. They clear customs in Juneau and then head west. And they're flying through Icy Strait. And they point out the small community of Gustavus. And then the pilot begins to marvel about the Fairweather Mountains and the awe he feels from the glaciers that flow from him. This pilot is flowing right into my world. And it's at that moment that my brain just slips out of the story. And I'm suddenly thinking of that poem, High Flight, which ends, "Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue, I top the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind I trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God." I do not know the hand that reached out on that morning of all mornings to bring my father and me together through the words on the pages of that book. But it was as if there in the living room, I suddenly heard the sound of a familiar airplane engine up above. And so I just dropped everything and I ran outside onto the front lawn. And I looked up and there was my dad circling. And so I began to wave my arms so I was big as possible so he could see me. And I watched and I waited, and he wiggled his wings. He circled one more time and then headed west.